1827, an English visitor to New York wrote a letter noting that American houses seemed built without the slightest reference to winter. He observed that families simply accepted the 6 months of brutal cold that they suffered through inside their own homes. That wasn't unusual. That was just winter. And for early Americans, freezing indoors was simply a fact of daily life. How does a country go from families freezing inside their homes to people complaining their apartment is too hot in February? It starts with something as simple as a wooden floorboard and a fireplace that barely worked at all. Before modern fiberglass and foam insulation, a house was not designed to keep you comfortably warm throughout the day. It was merely a windbreak, a fragile wooden shell standing between your family and the deadly elements outside. Water routinely froze in wash basins overnight, and waking up to ice inside your bedroom was fully expected. You didn't heat the house, you heated the people, and you did it using a series of exhausting, desperate strategies. Historians estimate that keeping a colonial home survivable required more manual labor than almost any other household chore. The cold dictated what you wore, where you sat, what you ate, and when you went to sleep. The walls were thin, the windows rattled in the wind, and the cold seeped upward through the bare earth. Surviving until spring wasn't guaranteed, especially for the very young or the elderly who couldn't withstand the constant chill. But the first line of defense wasn't the fire in the hearth. It was the physical shape of the house itself. If you walk into a preserved 18th century home today, the first thing you will immediately notice is the remarkably low ceilings. Those weren't built that way because people were shorter. They were built low to trap heat where people actually stood. Heat rises. A high ceiling in a colonial winter meant that all your precious warmth hovered uselessly above your head. Corridors were narrow, and doors were equipped with heavy thresholds to block the relentless drafts sweeping across the floorboards. Windows were kept small, not because glass was excessively expensive, but because every single pane of glass was a thermal nightmare. A single large window could drain the warmth from a room in minutes, leaving the inhabitants shivering in the dark. Families hung heavy wool blankets over the doors and windows, creating a makeshift tent inside their own living rooms. Even the layout of the rooms was designed specifically around the central chimney core to maximize any radiant heat. You didn't wander the house freely. You huddled in the specific zones where the temperature was slightly above freezing. Moving from the kitchen to a back bedroom felt like stepping outside into a harsh winter blizzard. By some accounts, temperatures in the outer rooms of a New England farmhouse regularly dropped below freezing by midnight. Children learned quickly that straying from the heated center of the house meant painful, stiff fingers and chattering teeth. The architecture was a survival mechanism, forcing families to live in tight, confined spaces for months on end. And that desperate structural necessity led directly to the creation of the single most important room in early American history. In colonial homes, this space was called the keeping room, a single chamber where the massive central hearth was located. When winter hit, the rest of the house was abandoned. The entire family moved into this one heated room. Cooking, eating, mending, and sleeping all happened in a space roughly the size of a modern one-car garage. The keeping room was the lifeboat. To leave it for too long was to risk serious frostbite or illness. By most accounts, families dragged their mattresses down from the freezing upstairs bedrooms and slept on the keeping room floor. The air was thick with wood smoke, the smell of cooking fat, and the unwashed bodies of 6 or 7 people. But that stale, smoky air meant you were alive. Fresh air in February was synonymous with a quick, freezing death. Even inside this lifeboat, the cold was relentless. Water buckets kept just a few feet from the fire would freeze. The heat radiated only a short distance. Your face might be roasting from the flames while your back was freezing. A common diary entry from the era describes ink freezing on the quill while sitting directly beside the roaring fire. You had to constantly rotate your body, turning like meat on a spit, just to keep your blood flowing evenly. The keeping room was a crowded, smoky sanctuary, offering no real comfort to the family, only raw, shivering survival. But eventually, the fire died down, and the real test of endurance began when the sun finally set. This is exactly where the story shifts from the architecture of the house to the vital microclimate of the bed. Going to sleep was a tactical operation. You didn't just climb under a blanket, you built a temporary insulated shelter. The foundation was a deep feather bed, greatly prized because feathers trap body heat better than raw wool or cotton. Before getting in, someone would run a brass bed warmer filled with hot coals rapidly between the freezing linen sheets. If you left the warmer in one spot for too long, it would scorch the fabric and start a fire. Once inside, families piled on heavy wool quilts, animal hides, and sometimes even their own thick woolen day clothes. The goal was to create a tiny, sealed envelope of warmth, completely isolating your body from the freezing room air. Breathing cold air all night could cause dangerous lung ailments, so people often pulled the heavy blankets over their heads. Sharing a bed wasn't just for couples. Siblings, strangers at inns, and entire families slept together to pool their heat. In New England, the strange custom of bundling allowed courting couples to share a bed, separated by a wooden board. It sounds scandalous today, but it was a purely practical way for young people to converse without freezing to death. Surviving the night meant staying perfectly still. Rolling over exposed you to the icy void at the edge of the mattress. Waking up meant breaking the seal, leaving your cocoon of warmth, and stepping onto a floor that felt like ice. Sleep was an exhausting defense mechanism, but it only masked the fundamental failure of the technology they relied on. That sounds like an unavoidable tragedy of the era. It was, but the main culprit was the fireplace itself. The classic open hearth is romanticized today as a cozy symbol of colonial life. But in reality, it was terribly flawed. An open fireplace operates at roughly 10 to 20% efficiency. Most of the heat simply vanishes. For every 10 logs you burned, the warmth from 8 of them went straight up the chimney into the winter sky. Worse than that, a roaring fire requires massive amounts of oxygen to sustain the combustion and keep the flames alive. As the hot air rushes up the flue, it creates a powerful vacuum inside the house, sucking in outside air. This meant the fire was actively pulling freezing winter winds through every single crack and gap in the wooden walls. The bigger you built the fire to stay warm, the stronger the icy draft sweeping across the floor became. Sitting in front of the hearth meant your shins were constantly blasted by freezing air rushing toward the roaring flames. The fireplace was a beautifully disguised trap, devouring fuel while simultaneously turning the house into a freezing wind tunnel. Women, whose long skirts dragged across these freezing floor drafts, suffered terribly from chilblains and chronic, agonizing joint pain. To combat this, they invented the wingback chair. The high sides weren't for aesthetics, they were to block the draft. The chair acted as a physical shield, catching the radiant heat while protecting the sitter's back from the icy wind. The very technology meant to save them was fighting against them, creating an endless, shivering cycle of cold. And that constant battle for warmth came with a steep physical cost that went far beyond mere discomfort. We think of winter sickness today as the result of germs spreading indoors. But back then, the cold itself was lethal. Wood shrinks when the temperature drops. As winter deepened, the gaps between the floorboards widened, letting in brutal, sub-zero winds. A common phrase from the era was, "catching your death." And it wasn't an exaggeration. A deep chill invited pneumonia. For infants and the elderly, the constant exposure to drafts weakened their immune systems until they simply could not recover. Physicians noted that winter mortality rates spiked significantly, driven not just from infectious disease, but from sheer, continuous bodily exhaustion. The human body burned a huge amount of calories just shivering, trying desperately to maintain a core temperature above freezing. People consumed heavy, fat-rich diets, suet puddings and thick stews, just to provide their bodies with the fuel needed to shiver. The air inside was so cold and damp that moisture from human breath condensed and froze directly on the interior walls. Mold grew in the dark corners, contributing to chronic lung issues that plagued early Americans throughout their entire lives. It was a brutal war of attrition. Every day was a struggle to gather enough heat to survive until tomorrow. And to generate that heat, families had to feed the inefficient fireplaces with an almost impossible amount of solid fuel. Keeping a fire burning day and night demanded relentless, back-breaking labor, essentially turning every homeowner into a full-time, exhausted lumberjack. It was an exhausting, endless cycle that quickly pushed the young nation toward an environmental crisis nobody had truly anticipated. This brings us to a silent, creeping disaster that nearly broke the entire country before it even had fully formed. The forests were gone. Before the revolution, America seemed like an endless supply of free fuel for anyone holding an axe. But those inefficient fireplaces devoured wood at a terrifying rate. A typical family burned 20 to 30 cords a year. A cord is a stack of wood 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. Imagine chopping 30 of those. By the late 1700s, major cities like Boston and Philadelphia had stripped the surrounding landscape of all usable burning timber. Firewood had to be hauled from miles away, making it incredibly expensive and increasingly difficult for common people to acquire. America's very first energy crisis wasn't about oil or electricity. It was a desperate, shivering shortage of basic firewood. The price of wood skyrocketed, transforming basic warmth from a natural human right into a luxury only the rich could afford. Wealthy families stockpiled cords in their yards, while the poor were reduced to burning broken furniture and old wooden fences. During harsh winters, the urban poor froze to death in their tenements, simply because they could not afford a single log. City officials frequently had to distribute emergency wood to keep half their population from perishing in the January freezes. The open hearth was no longer a viable survival tool. It was starving the cities and bankrupting the working class. The nation was freezing, and the landscape was vanishing. Something had to change before the cities became uninhabitable death traps. They needed a way to get more heat out of less wood, to stop the warmth from escaping up the chimney. And the solution to that crisis came from one of the most famous, brilliant minds of the 18th century. In 1742, Benjamin Franklin designed an iron box that sat inside the fireplace, aiming to capture and radiate more heat. The Franklin stove, or Pennsylvania fireplace, baffled the smoke and forced the iron to absorb the fire's intense thermal energy. It was a brilliant concept, promising twice the heat with a quarter of the wood, revolutionizing indoor winter survival. However, Franklin's original design was famously flawed, often failing to draw smoke properly and choking the room with thick soot. But the core idea survived. Over the next few decades, inventors refined the cast iron stove, moving it completely out of the hearth. A freestanding iron stove standing in the middle of a room radiated heat in all directions, changing the dynamic forever. Suddenly, the efficiency jumped. You could comfortably heat a room with a handful of wood instead of an entire massive log. The stovepipe carried the smoke outside, while the heavy metal body held the heat long after the fire died. Families could finally leave the keeping room. They could warm the parlor, the bedrooms, and the rest of the house. For the first time in history, the house stopped being a mere windbreak and actually became a source of sustained warmth. It was a technological miracle that saved millions of acres of forest and kept the urban working class from freezing. The cast iron stove became the glowing heart of the American home, celebrated as the ultimate triumph over the bitter winter. But every technological leap casts a shadow, and this miracle iron box brought a dark new threat into the parlor. That sounds like an undeniable victory. It was, but the ultimate cost was quietly paid in human lungs. By the mid-19th century, wood was largely replaced by coal, a dense, powerful fuel that burned hotter and much longer. Coal stoves could burn all night without needing to be restocked, meaning families finally woke up to warm rooms. But burning coal indoors, even inside an iron stove, released toxic gases, invisible carbon monoxide, and a layer of greasy soot. The air inside the Victorian home became dangerously polluted. The walls were stained black, and the air smelled like harsh sulfur. Doctors began reporting a rise in respiratory illnesses, headaches, and chronic fatigue among women who spent their days indoors. The tight iron stoves also removed moisture from the air, creating a bone-dry atmosphere that cracked lips and irritated throats. People survived the freezing cold, but they were slowly poisoning themselves with the very fumes meant to keep them alive. The house was finally warm, but it was suffocating. The air quality in a winter parlor was frequently, silently hazardous. In their desperate quest to defeat the cold, society had inadvertently traded freezing to death for chronic, low-level suffocation. It became clear that heating the room wasn't enough. The walls themselves needed to change to hold the warmth safely. The architectural shell had to evolve, blocking the cold from entering so that fires wouldn't need to burn so violently. This realization sparked a slow, necessary transition toward the invisible technology that now dictates our comfortable, modern lives today. If the evolution had stopped right there, we would still be choking on coal dust every single freezing December. At the turn of the 20th century, builders finally began to treat the walls of a house as a thermal barrier. They stopped relying solely on fire and started stuffing the empty wall cavities with whatever rough materials they could find. Early insulation was improvised and bizarre. Layers of old newspaper, sawdust, seaweed, and even dried corn cobs packed between the studs. It was a crude attempt to trap dead air, preventing the expensive indoor heat from bleeding out into the winter. Around the same time, central heating systems utilizing basement coal boilers and steam radiators began replacing individual room stoves. The radiator fundamentally changed the landscape of the home, pushing consistent, regulated heat into every single room simultaneously. But during the 1918 flu pandemic, health officials believed fresh, freezing air was the only way to stop the deadly virus. The Board of Health ordered families to keep their windows wide open, even in the middle of a freezing February. To compensate, engineers deliberately oversized the cast iron radiators, designing them to heat a room even while a blizzard blew inside. The goal was to provide a massive wall of radiant heat that could outcompete the freezing winds pouring through the windows. This over-engineering permanently altered the baseline of indoor comfort, paving the way for the insulated, modern home. The war against winter had shifted from a desperate battle for survival to a perfectly engineered, invisible climate control system. And that historical journey leaves us with a fascinating, hidden truth about the spaces we live in today. This is exactly why those charming, historic floor plans feel so cramped, and why your apartment radiator drives you crazy today. Low ceilings and tight hallways in colonial homes aren't quaint design choices. They are literal thermal survival mechanisms. And that oversized radiator roasting your apartment is a century-old pandemic defense system, still running exactly as it was designed. We conquered the cold so thoroughly that we forgot how terrifying it used to be just to sit in your living room. Think about that stunned English visitor in 1827, watching his wash basin freeze completely solid beside his own bed. For most of human history, a house wasn't a warm refuge. It was just a place where you froze, slightly slower. The technology changed. The brutal cold outside didn't. The only difference is that we entirely forgot what it felt like. We solved the ancient problem so completely that we simply forgot it was ever a life-threatening problem at all. If this dive into the hidden survival history of everyday life kept you hooked, hit the subscribe button below. We uncover bizarre, forgotten history like this every single week, revealing the strange truth behind the things you never noticed. Take a second to leave a comment about how you survive winter. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Stay warm, check your floorboards for drafts, and we will see you in the next bizarre historical episode.